The war that nobody's telling you the truth about. Let me ask you something before we get into this. When was the last time a war made complete sense to you, not the version they sold you on the news, but the real mechanics underneath it? Because what's unfolding right now is one of those rare moments where if you understand the actual strategy, you realize the people executing it might be digging their own grave. Let's break it down, what America is actually doing. There are three things happening simultaneously, and none of them are being framed honestly. The first is what military planners call decapitation, targeting leadership structures, command chains, the decision-making brain of a nation. The goal sounds clean on paper. Remove the people giving orders and the machine falls apart. The second is air supremacy overwhelming the skies, destroying military infrastructure, and here's the part that doesn't make the headlines: soft targeting. Soft targeting isn't hitting weapons depots, it's hitting hospitals. It's degrading a society's ability to recover, to heal, to function, and then there's the double tap you. Strike a location, wait for the doctors and the families and the rescue workers to arrive, and you strike again. It's designed to paralyze people psychologically, to make helping others feel like a death sentence. That's not strategy, that's terror, and it violates international law. The third pillar is funding and arming ethnic insurgent groups inside Iran, the Kurds, the Baloch, others, to fracture the country from within. Now here's where it gets interesting, why this strategy is going to backfire. Every single one of these three tactics is going to produce the opposite of its intended effect, and I want you to really sit with this, because it's not obvious until you think it through. Start with decapitation. Yes, Iran has had a bloated leadership structure for years, too many factions, too many competing egos, too many people who all think they should be the one calling the shots. You know what killing off layers of leadership does? It streamlines that mess. It forces the survivors to be sharper, more unified, more strategic. America isn't weakening Iran's command structure, it's pruning it. It's doing Iran a favor it never would have done for itself. Now, the bombing, for decades, Iran's biggest internal fault line has been the tension between its urban, educated, secular population and its rural, deeply religious communities. These two groups have looked at each other with suspicion and contempt. There have been protests, riots, a society quietly tearing itself apart. But the moment you start carpet bombing cities, the exact cities where that secular, progressive population lives, you don't radicalize them toward the government they've been resisting. You unite them against the people dropping the bombs. Shared suffering creates shared identity. The internal fracture closes. Suddenly Iranians stop seeing each other as the enemy. And the insurgency strategy? Arming minorities to rise up against the Persian majority? That's going to do something nobody in Washington apparently considered. For decades, Persian national identity has been deliberately suppressed by the theocracy. They wanted a pan-Islamic identity that transcended ethnicity. But when you weaponize other groups against Persia, you awaken something ancient. You force Persian people to reach back into thousands of years of history, to remember who they were before any of this. Persian civilization is one of the oldest and proudest on earth. You don't want to be the one that reminds them of that. What Iran is going to do, forget the framing of a conventional war. Iran isn't going to fight America in the open. They don't have to. What's coming is guerrilla warfare, one of the oldest and most effective counters to siege tactics in human history. Think of it as a brutal, extended game of hide and seek. America bombs, Iran disappears into the mountains. Then when the pressure eases, Iran sends drones into GCC countries, lobs rockets, keeps the wound open. Not a knockout punch, just a constant, maddening bleed. The genius of this is that it exploits America's core weakness in this conflict: time. America needs this war to end fast. There is no political will at home for a prolonged engagement. The manufacturing capacity to sustain a long war isn't there. The tolerance for American casualties isn't there. America is trying to win cheaply, quickly, and cleanly, and guerrilla warfare makes that impossible. The most dangerous scenario? America gets frustrated enough to launch a ground invasion. If that happens, it's over not for Iran, but for America. Look at the geography: mountains, deserts, terrain that has swallowed empires. Iran would want nothing more than to drag American boots onto that ground, because that's where the asymmetry becomes absolute. So why is this war even happening? Here's where it stops being a strategy conversation and becomes something stranger. The rational case for this war doesn't hold up. Senior American generals have reportedly been warning against an Iran conflict for years, calling it suicidal. The nuclear negotiations were apparently going somewhere. The Iranians were, by multiple accounts, willing to come to the table, and yet here we are. The official explanations don't stick. One version, nuclear talks collapsed, but the evidence says otherwise. Another version, and this was actually stated publicly by the Secretary of State, was essentially, we heard the Israelis were going to strike Iran. Iran would have retaliated against both Israel and the US, so we struck first. That's not strategy. That's improvisation dressed up in a suit. But then there's a third explanation that's harder to dismiss because it's being reported from inside the military itself. Soldiers being deployed are reportedly being told this is a war for the second coming of Jesus, a war for Armageddon, the game nobody told you was. Being played, this is where everything reframes. We assume wars are fought over oil, land, regional dominance, economic leverage, material things. And when you apply game theory to material incentives, the American strategy in Iran looks like a disaster because it is. But what if the people making these decisions aren't playing the material game? What if the reward thereafter isn't measured in barrels of oil or regional influence? The real currency at play here, the thing that every empire, every religion, every propaganda machine in history has understood, is human consciousness. Attention, belief, the ability to shape how billions of people understand reality. Because here's what's true. The world that exists is, at its foundation, built from human perception. The stories we believe determine how we organize, who we trust, what we're willing to die for, control what people believe, and you control what they build, what they destroy, who they follow. This war, at its deepest level, isn't a military operation. It's a narrative operation, a fight to control what the human race believes about itself, about power, about the divine. That sounds abstract, I know. But think about it, why would generals risk a war they know they can't win conventionally unless they believed winning meant something beyond the conventional? If the goal is to trigger a prophesied event, something that reshapes the spiritual and psychological architecture of the world, then the military math becomes secondary. This is World War III, not as a resource war, not as a border dispute, but as a war for the soul of the species. Whoever wins this, whoever controls the story that comes out of it, controls the consciousness of humanity for generations. It is your age. This is the part of this course we've been building toward all semester. All the game theory, all the historical analysis, it leads here. Because once you understand that the most powerful force on earth isn't a weapon or a dollar or a vote, but a human mind that believes something deeply enough to act on it, everything else starts. To make sense, the question isn't just who wins this war. The question is, who gets to decide what the war meant?